Hi guys, Kurt Rish here, and thanks for joining me on the One Shepherd YouTube channel, where we are supporting seekers and believers. So, in your walk with Christ, one of the things you need to do is spend time in His Word. That's the way we open the door for God to talk with us or communicate with us His will. But it's also His Word contains what He wants us to know. In sharing a piece of my testimony, I indicated that. I was reading it for the wrong reasons. What's interesting about that, scripture tells us that it will bear fruit, and it did. It those seeds got planted, and eventually I found my way to Christ. But anyhow, so tonight we're going to look at study tools, things to help us study scripture. And so if we're going to do that, the first thing we need to do is understand why there's all these different so-called versions of scripture out there. The reality is, it's not that there's different versions, there's different translations from the original Greek and Hebrew into English, or in some cases from the Latin into English. So anyhow, we're gonna go through the different approaches that have been used to translate. We are going to ignore there are some dishonest translations out there that have been translated for different reasons. I'm not going to get into that. I don't want to debate it. What I am going to do is talk about the standard ways of translating, um, and what you know I like about both and what I don't like. I'm going to share uh, uh, the versions that I use, or that I like. I'm not here to debate which one's best or which one's worst. So, anyhow, the first type of translation is what they call a formal equivalent. This is a direct word for word translation. This is the kind I like to read first and foremost. Although the challenge with a word for word translation is that when you're coming from Greek and Hebrew, there's sometimes the word they have, we don't have a single word equivalent. Sometimes it's a phrase. If you go back to my video on uh, why we study scripture, if you remember, I mentioned the Greek word theopneustos, which is translated as inspired, but the more accurate translation would be God breathed, which again, I would argue has a far greater implications than just inspired. But anyhow, so a formal equivalent that I use, and it's the one I tend to read the most, is the New American Standard Bible. A lot of scholars consider that to be the best modern word for word translation. The second type of translation is a literal translation. This is where it's kind of a blending of the formal equivalent and the next one we're going to talk about, which is the dynamic equivalent. A literal translation you seeks to do word for word, but also thought for thought. So this is kind of middle ground, and depending on the translation, they may be closer to a formal equivalent, which means direct word for word, or they may be closer to a dynamic equivalent, which is thought for thought. So I use two different literal translations. I use the English Standard Version, which is a fairly modern translation, and the King James Version, which is obviously a much older translation, even the one we use today, which is based more on the 1800s rather than the original King James. The so the as you move into that thought for thought, which is a dynamic equivalent translation, the one concern I tend to have with thought for thought is you're now depending on the editor or the publisher or who's ever doing the translation. You're depending on their interpretation of what the intent of a particular verse in scripture is. Um, Now, having said that, I do use a dynamic equivalent. I use the International Version, so the NIV. However, I'm going to qualify. I use the 1978 NIV, and the reason I do is because That is the original translation for the NIV. And after that, each translation or update, however you want to put it, they've done since, they have made tweaks that have made the language a little more or a little less specific. I'll put it that way. Um, a lot of people use the NIV, they like it. I tend to go between all of these different versions that I've mentioned. I usually read the NASB first, then I'll read if I'm not sure of something or I have a question, I'll look at the ESV or the KJV, or I'll look at my NIV. Um, Now, the next version is not one I typically recommend. It is definitely not one I recommend to read as your main Bible, but maybe to give you some insight or as a teaching tool, it can be pretty good. And that's a paraphrase. And paraphrase simply means a restatement of. So, in other words, this is the translators, and actually not even a translator, this is somebody reading the Bible and restating what they believe it says. Obviously, the real problem here is if somebody's pretty loose in how they do this, you can get a pretty questionable read. Uh, the one I have looked at off and on is the Message. I'm not a big fan of Paraphrase, so I personally don't use it. Uh, but there are a number of paraphrase out there, and the Message is one of the more well recognized ones. Again, the problem here is you're depending upon somebody else's interpretation. Now, the next types of Bibles out there, I do use one. I use a New King James Study Bible. It's published by Nelson, who is a pretty reputable publisher. Uh, the study Bibles are pretty nice. They have different resources in them, everything from the translator or an editor's commentary to nice maps. It can even have, depending on the study Bible you get, it may have a Strong's Concordance, which I'll talk about later, or some form of concordance, which I'll get into that in a little bit. But study Bibles can be a great tool. Like I said, I use a New King James. By the way, a King James is generally considered a literal translation. Um, so the study Bible can be a great tool. I typically recommend one, especially if you're newer to studying Scripture. Just tend to try to pay attention to the publisher and their reputation. There are some questionable publishers out there that will just publish any book, and they're not necessarily focused or staying true to uh, Scripture. So again, pay attention to the publisher. The one I use is Nelson. Actually, I have two of them. I have a Tyndale and I have a Nelson Study Bible. Um, Now, the next type of Bible is called a reference Bible. This is one of my favorites, a reference Bible. What that does is as you read scripture, it cites any references that are being made by a particular verse you're reading. For example, Jesus did this constantly, and so did Paul. He would refer back to the Old Testament. He would quote the Old Testament. So as Jesus was quoting the Old Testament, as you're reading that, it will cite where that quote comes from. It'll also cite any scripture that is dealing with that particular, or depending on the reference Bible, may cite scripture that's dealing with the same discussion or similar. So reference Bibles are really good, especially as you struggle, as you're reading. If you have a particular uh, phrase or verse that you're not real clear on, if you can chase a reference, oftentimes you'll get clarity from that. Of course, one of the things I often stress, I stress that in my first one, make sure you go back and you read in context. Don't just read a single verse and think you're going to understand it. Now, another type of Bible to use is a parallel Bible. Now, a parallel Bible does what I mentioned already, which is it allows you to look at different translations side by side. So, for example, if I don't own a parallel Bible, but I do use a digital parallel Bible, and what I will pull up is I'll have my NASB right there with the KJV, so the King James, with an NIV, so that I'm getting to look at three of the more common translations. And a lot of times, if I'm trying to get clarity, those will help me. Um, Now, the last type of Bible I'm going to mention, actually, I'm sorry, there is a couple more. But the next one is by far my favorite, but this is a tool for either people who are very much into studying or have been studying for a long time, which I tend to fall into both. My wife often jokes that, I relax by studying. So, anyhow, and this is an interlinear Bible. An interlinear Bible has the original Hebrew or the original Greek right there for you to look at. And right below it is direct word for word translation. Um, Ideally, the interlinear, if it's done properly, like mine is. Now, mine is 5 volumes. It's not one book, it's 5 books. The interlinear Bible. Um, when you read it, if it's done properly, first off, it's the truest word for word translation you can get. Now, what that means though is when you read Hebrew, when you read the Old Testament, instead of reading like we do, you read from right to left. That's the first thing. The second thing is Hebrew doesn't have a lot of the connector things like the does, the ands, the is. So you have to read that in context and understand through context what it's talking about. Um, so that's one of the challenges with the interlinear. The nice thing with the interlinear, though, I read it often to get clarification or to check things when I see something I'm not sure about. Um, that direct word for word. The other challenge here is that because they don't write like we do, they don't write with the subject and verb and all that in the same order. So you have to get used to that. But the great thing is, a lot of times you get clarity when you read it because as you read it more and more, you'll come to recognize, oh, okay, so what they're talking about, and it'll just bring clarity for you. Um, Now, the last type of Bible I'm going to touch on is a topical Bible. Topical Bibles are great for very specific things, but I'm going to tell you to be careful with a topical Bible. I think it tends to develop some bad habits. Topical Bibles, what they do is they allow you to study a particular subject. So if you want to study love, for example, it'll give you all the verses on love, and you can study through that. Um, that's great, but the problem is, if you're not reading in context, first off, you can get things out of you can get them wrong. So it's important to read in context, and the topical Bibles do tend to encourage you to read things out of context because it cites generally they cite the verses you need to look at. Um, the other thing with the topical Bible is it, again, it's dependent upon somebody else's opinion or interpretation because they're going to cite the verses that they have found, not necessarily all the verses. To be candid, in most cases, if you read any book of the Bible, you will find it will deal with most of the subjects you're trying to look up. But there's using the other tools, you can often find um, the verses you need. In particular, using a reference Bible is a great tool for that. Anyhow, so that's it for Bibles. Let's move on to the next subject. Okay, let's move on and talk about some reference material. I already mentioned one, which was the Strong's Exhaustive Concordance. Concordance in general, it provides the basics of it is it's going to provide the definitions of the original words in whatever language they were in. And when I say definition, that's important to pay attention to because if you remember, I said I like word for word translations. However, um, oftentimes a phrase is more necessary. Um, so by looking at a Strong's Concordance, you can look up and get the definition, the true meaning of a particular word. There are many words that the Greeks and the Hebrews use that have a slightly different meaning than what maybe we understand. One I can think of is not the word knowledge, and I'm not going to tell you what it means. You can look it up, but it has a slightly different meaning than the way we understand it. Um, so that's a simple and great tool. Another one is a lexicon or a dictionary. This is simply another way to look up the word and the exact meaning, although it's not necessarily based on the Hebrew or the Greek. It's based on our modern language typically. Another tool that I find very valuable, depending on the particular readings I'm doing, is a biblical atlas. Biblical Atlas is neat because it lets you see where things are and where they're happening and what part of the world. Sometimes that can be very important to understand, when it's talking about Babylon versus obviously Egypt, but versus, you know, other parts of the world. A biblical atlas is nice because it lets you see, for example, Galatia, the book of Galatians. These are people that were in Turkey, modern day Turkey. And what's interesting is as you do a study, you'll learn that the Galatians were Celtic peoples. Um, so it's not what we often think of. So a biblical atlas is nice. Now, a tool I've come to use more in recent years is historical references. Flavius Josephus and Tacitus are two examples. One of the great things is because these books were written so long ago, you can actually get digital copies of their books for free online. You can download them, and you can look at what they wrote. These are, when I say historical references, these are extra biblical. These are people like Flavius Josephus was a Jewish historian writing history for Rome. So it's pretty cool because you can read what he wrote about Jesus, for example. Pretty clear, that he knew Jesus to be a real person. Um, so those are always worth checking out. Um, Another tool is Bible timelines. Now, personally, what I would recommend is you find a Bible timeline exercise. I teach one in one of my courses. Um, I have my students do a Bible timeline. That is an awesome experience. I did it that way the first time, where we had to take 24 foot of paper and roll it out and create a Bible timeline from the beginning of creation to today. And it's pretty cool because you get to see things you don't recognize. Like, for example, you don't realize how close Adam actually lived to the time of the flood, for example, or at least till Noah. So it's pretty cool that you can see the fact that those generations were there. Um, and it lets you see how much happened when, for example, in that time of the, right after, well, from the time Christ was born till, the end of the New Testament, which is, in the AD 90s when it finally is fully complete, how much actually happened in that time frame. Another thing, another good study tool, and these are things that I actually use some of these to hand out to other people. They're what I just call extra biblical sources. These are things like the book More Than Just a Carpenter, which, is a similar book to The Case for Christ. Uh, Both are the story of a man's journey to find Christ, or an atheist's journey to find Christ. And they're both of those are great books. I like to use More Than Just Carpenter to hand out to people. I carry some around with me. Great explanations, great historical arguments, and arguments for why that Christ lived and died and was resurrected. So great little tool. Kingdom of the Cults is another outstanding book. Kingdom of the Cults is one that deals with religions that claim Christianity, and notice I say claim Christianity. They don't necessarily rely on the Bible as their primary source. So anyhow, Kingdom of the Cults is excellent to read. Manners and Customs of the Bible. This is another book I really like. It explains what the world was like in Bible times and how they thought, how they lived. So it's well worth taking a look at. Okay, guys. So we are going to look at several different digital study tools or digital resources. So the first one I have up here is called eSword. Now this is eSword Lite. There is a paid version. This is the free version. I use this a lot. If you look at this at the top, you can see I'm using a King James Bible, and it says King James Plus because I have the Strong's Concordance up in the scripture. So as you see, if we're looking at Matthew 22, verse 34 right there at the top under where it says Great Commandment, you could read the verse. But when the Pharisees had heard that he had put the Sadducees to silence, they were gathered together. What's cool is those numbers indicate the Strong's Concordance number for the particular word. And we can touch on the word. For example, I'm going to touch on the number right beside Pharisees, which is G5330. And now we get the Greek word, which is phariseos. The definition, it's of Hebrew origin, and it means a separatist that is exclusively religious, or a Pharisean that is Jewish sectary. Of course, we know him as Pharisee. So this is one of my favorite reasons for using eSword, but you can do all sorts of things here. Down at the bottom, you can see there's a commentary for the different scripture. If I touch on that, you'll get a little commentary on Matthew 22, verses 34 through 46. There's a reference. You can look at the different references related to this, and at the top you can see there's some other verses cited. Today, you get a scripture reading, or this evening a scripture reading with a little bit of commentary. There is a dictionary here, so you can look up different words. There's a lexicon, which is really the same thing, except for in this case they're tying Strong's Concordance under a lexicon, which is reasonable. Anyhow, so I'm just going to go back to that. This is just to give you a quick taste of eSword. So that's eSword. Okay, guys, so this is Logos, and as you can see, Logos is very similar to eSword. From what I understand, the paid version of Logos is quite a bit more in-depth than eSword, though. But I can't say. I've never used either of the paid versions. So across the bottom here, of course, you can see that you have different options. There's a Strong's Concordance, a study of systematic theology as well. You can actually go to the store and download other books. There is reading sources, that you can download. You can start a reading plan. So there's some pretty nice features here. Again, of course, it has that concordance just like I showed you with eSword. Over here you can see other options. There is an audio book. There is different courses you can do. So definitely well worth taking a look at, and another good digital tool. So let's go ahead and look at the next tool here, which is the Blue Letter Bible. Blue Letter Bible was one of the, from what I understand, one of the earlier Bible tools that was available online. It was originally strictly an online tool, from what I understand. And they've improved it quite a bit. It's much more expansive. It's very similar now to eSword or Logos. You have a lot of different resources. Of course, here you can see a Bible. One thing I do like is you can see which version of the Bible you're using. If you notice right under Isaiah 1, it says NASB 1995 edition. So that's the particular Bible or translation we're using. Down across the top, you do have some additional features which are kind of nice. You have this ability to bookmark, which you can do that with the others. You have readings you can do related. You can, create a notebook, so you can create a journal. You can search it. Up here you do have the option to select different Bibles. One thing I would like to see that I have not found, now it's possible they have it and I just haven't noticed it, but is things like the Strong's Concordance would be pretty nice here. There is a quick start, a quick help here, so you can see, you just flip through it. But this is the Blue Letter Bible, another great helpful tool. So this next tool is Bible Hub, which is one of the first online Bible study tools I used. I used to use it to do a lot of word searches or search a particular topic. Here again, I believe Bible Hub is one of the older online tools, but they have really brought it forward. It's got a lot of nice features now. They have, of course, just the general Bible here, and you can do readings. You can, across the top there, you can see you can select different translations. You have the audio Bible. There are sermons available. There is a parallel Bible, which I had mentioned earlier, so you can select different versions to look at. So like I had the NIV up, but you could look at the New Living Translation, and compare that to a different version. You can look at the King James. So that's a nice feature. You have that parallel. You also have an interlinear, which I had mentioned. So see here is nice. You can actually see the Greek and the Hebrew writing. In this case, it's Hebrew, by the way. So as you look at this, you can see right below it the literal translation. Like, remember with Hebrew, we read right to left. So the first word is Bereshit, which means in the beginning. So here's a perfect example of how a literal translation or a word-for-word translation doesn't actually work. You have to, realize that the phrase is in the beginning for the word Bereshit. So some tremendous study tools here. You also do have the option to pull a concordance up here, as well as several other tools. So if you click here, you can see there's different, versions you can pick. You can use the NASB 1995 or the 1977. Or other versions. Here you can pick your different books. We just go back to Genesis and select Genesis 1. There's our reading for Genesis 1. So again, a lot of nice features here. That a great study tool. This particular study tool, when I first really came to Christ and was seeking to grow, and actually, by the way, the first time I ever read the Bible the whole way through, I used the Bible app to help me. This Bible app, from what I understand, is the largest Christian Bible app out there. It's just called the Bible app, and it's pretty nice. They have different lesson or study plans. I would tell you to be a little careful because some of the people on it that have created those study plans, in my opinion, are a bit questionable, so I'd be careful. I would also tell you that generally if you're reading more of their writing than Scripture when you're studying, it's one I would be careful with. One of the things cool about the Bible app, too, is it lets you create verse images, as you can see here. Gives you a verse of the day. But one of the really nice features I like is you can create this community. As you can see here, different people have invited me to do things or are asking for prayers. I have a big list of friends. So it's kind of nice because it's, has its own little internal, essentially, Facebook for Christians on the Bible app. So another tool that's really similar to the Bible app is the Olive Bible. Here again, you have the Bible and you can select different versions or translations. You also, across the top here, you can see you have different reading plans. I would caution you the same way I did about the Bible app with the reading plans. So as I said, you can look at those. You do have some other features here, about your reading, your history, different things you can tag. There's also different books, again, you can download, similar to some of these other Bible tools I've showed you. I haven't used the Olive Bible much, but I've used it a little bit, and I found it to be helpful. So this app is one of my favorite apps. This is the Through the Word app. When you're busy, it's great because it's an audio Bible, combined with short teachings. So as you can see, like if you look at the book of Nehemiah there that I have up, Chris Langham is the pastor leading the teachings. Usually each teaching, ranges between, 7 or 8 minutes up to, I think the longest I've seen is 15 or 20 minutes. And then it reads a chapter of the Bible to you. So it's a great study tool. It's a great way to hear the word. Again, one of my favorite tools. I've done many, many different books with this tool. So well worth taking a look at. The next thing I want to look at is a great resource if you are somebody who is really into apologetics, which is, of course, defending the faith, in this case through science, looking at evolution and actually all sorts of science and how science confirms Scripture's account. So this is Answers in Genesis. This is their app. And you can see here different things about evolution and debunking evolution and the age of the earth and different sciences. So this is a great tool, especially for a parent, or if you were like me when I first really was coming to Christ. One of my stumbling blocks was science. I have a science background, so I had to spend a lot of time studying and coming to understand what the science really does show. So here again, that's the Answers in Genesis. So another good study tool is actually checking out some of the better known pastors out there. Of course, you need to check anything they say against Scripture, just like anybody else, just because they're very reputable. For example, David Jeremiah is probably one of the best known pastors for teaching on the end time prophecy. Yet I would still tell you to check anything he says against Scripture. So as you can see here, his Turning Point app, you have lots of different things you can take a look at in terms of different sermons, different teachings from him. So well worth checking out, especially, if you're looking to do a very specific study. Sometimes you'll get some great advice from one of these pastors. Now, the next one I'm going to show you is Chip Ingram. And Chip Ingram has Living on the Edge, and this is his app. Here again, great topical studies. He's probably one of my favorite pastors to listen to, personally. I do a lot of studies, but I frequently would listen to Chip Ingram. As you can see here, a lot of very good teachings on teaching love while speaking truth, which is something that you gotta. It's one of those things that's hard to find. So Chip's got another good research tool here. He does talk about some other options down at the bottom, like discipleship and those types of things. Now, I got to put a little plug in for my favorite Scotsman here, Alistair Begg, and his Truth for Life app, and or Truth for Life Ministries, I should say. But anyhow, as you can see here, he has lots of different resources as well, good sermons, some different topical studies for you. He also has different devotionals. So here again, a lot of good tools for you to check out. Okay, so the last thing I'm going to touch on tonight is one that I think people often fail to think about as a study resource for studying Scripture, but that is a church. And I don't mean the building, although sometimes church buildings have a great library. I'm talking about the church as in the body. This can mean talking to some mature Christians. It can mean talking with your pastor. But the first thing I'm going to say about it is this. We go to church to, come together in fellowship, to worship God, to learn and to grow. And we can do that all different ways. We're not always just dependent upon the pastor. And, if you remember, one of the things that I've said over and over, if you're talking about Scripture, if you're discussing something you've read or a question you have, and somebody tells you about something Scripture says, make sure you go back to Scripture and you check it. Don't just take their word for it. But when if you're going to use a church for help, I always like to tell people, make sure it's a solid Bible teaching church. Ideally if you go to their services, you want to hear them teaching scripture word for word, verse by verse. Um, you know, Generally a church that avoids topical teaching. Topical teaching is not all bad. It has its place, but the problem is you might only hear 4 verses of scripture in an hour and a half. Um, you know, to me, I want to hear scripture. I'm not really necessarily there to hear, the pastor talk for 45 minutes and for 5 minutes read scripture to me. I want to hear scripture. If they can expound on that scripture as they go, great. Again, that's my personal preference, but you know, simply put, guys, church can be a great resource. So, guys, that wraps up the discussion on study tools. If you have questions, if you are looking for more information, feel free to comment below, shoot me a message, and I'd be glad to help out. Thanks for joining me here. Hopefully, in the next few days, we'll have our website up. We're still working on it. Once that's up, I'll also include these study resources on that website. In the meantime, have a great day and God bless.